Hello lovers. Eleanor here. Tonight, we will embark on a journey that begins not in the distant past, but here, in the stillness of my own living room. The rain is tapping against the window, like a patient knuckle on a door that no one quite dares to open. The armchair beside mine remains empty, as it has for many years now. Sometimes I think the silence of this house has its own weight. A hush so dense it settles into my bones. I've often wondered if the ancients knew this kind of silence, or if their nights, even in solitude, were always filled with the hum of human voices and the crackle of fires. If you enjoy these journeys through time, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And perhaps, after tonight's story, you might share a favorite historical tale of your own in the comments. Now, settle in comfortably, close your eyes, and let's travel back in time with Eleanor. They say history belongs to the victors, but there are rare figures, like Spartacus, who claim their place without ever truly winning. He was, depending on who you ask, a freedom fighter, a violent rebel, or simply a man pushed too far. And like all people whose lives are caught between the cracks of legend and truth, he has been painted in colors both noble and damning. I think of him often when I walk down to the market and see the casual indifference of people rushing past one another, each locked in their own little battles. Jobs, bills, heartbreaks. Perhaps Spartacus's story resonates because he too began as an invisible man in someone else's system. And yet he managed to make the whole world see him. Before the fame, or the infamy, he was simply a man from Thrace, that rugged land between Greece and the Black Sea. The ancient writers tell us he may have been a soldier in Rome's auxiliary forces, perhaps even fighting for the very people who would later enslave him. And isn't that a bitter twist? To fight under a banner, only to be bound beneath it. I sometimes think of the irony in my own life. How I taught history to young faces for decades, hoping to arm them with understanding, only to find myself old and alone, my voice echoing off these walls. We fight for causes that don't always fight for us back. No one agrees on how Spartacus fell into slavery. Some claim desertion, others capture in battle, or perhaps even betrayal by those he trusted. The details are foggy, much like the way grief blurs certain years of my life into indistinct shapes. What matters is that he found himself in chains, sold not to labor in fields, but to fight for sport in the brutal schools of gladiators. Capua. That was the city where his fate turned. Imagine a training ground where men were honed into weapons, each day sharpening both their muscles and their despair. Here, under the watchful eyes of Lanisti, the trainers, Spartacus learned how to kill not enemies in battle, but strangers for the pleasure of others. There is something about that transformation that chills me. To take a human being and turn them into a spectacle, a living performance of pain and survival. What kind of society sustains itself on that? And yet, if I'm honest, haven't we all, in quieter ways, watched others suffer for our entertainment? Not in the arena, perhaps, but in gossip, in cruel jokes, in the detached curiosity with which we read about strangers' tragedies online. But there was a seed in Spartacus, something that the lash and the shouting crowds could not crush. Some say it was a longing for home. Others, a simple refusal to die on someone else's terms. I think of that stubborn ember often, because in my loneliest days, when I feel the walls pressing in, I too cling to small rebellions. The act of planting new roses in the garden, of baking bread just for myself, of reading by candlelight as though waiting for company that will never come. In that school of fighters, surrounded by men who had been broken and remade into beasts. Spartacus must have felt the contours of a plan forming. It wasn't yet the great revolt history would remember. It was simply the quiet knowledge that this was not the end of his story. And that knowledge, my dears, is dangerous. For once a person sees beyond the horizon of their cage, the bars are already weaker. As I sit here tonight, the rain still pattering softly, I think about how the loneliness of my days mirrors his captivity in a strange way. I am free to walk the streets, to speak to anyone I wish. Yet I, too, am hemmed in by circumstances not of my choosing. But unlike Spartacus, I have only memories to rally, not an army. Still, the thought lingers. What might happen if we each found our own quiet rebellion? If, in the small routines of our lives, we refuse to be entirely defined by the roles we were given? Spartacus's journey is about to unfold. And with it, the proof that even in the most constrained of lives, the will can stretch farther than the chains. Capua was not a place for dreaming. Yet dreams had a way of seeping into the cracks of even the harshest stones. The gladiator school was a fortress in all but name. Thick walls, iron gates, the stale scent of sweat and oil clinging to every corner. The clang of swords during training hours was a constant, like a cruel heartbeat. And in that relentless rhythm, Spartacus began to listen. Not to the orders shouted at him, but to the murmurs of the men beside him. They were an unlikely brotherhood. Thracians, Gauls, Greeks, and a handful of Romans fallen from grace. Each carried a story. Some spoken freely in the dim hours after lights were doused. Others guarded like precious gold. One man claimed he'd once owned a vineyard before a debt dragged him here. Another had been a soldier, decorated for bravery, only to be sold for treachery he swore he did not commit. These were not mindless brutes. They were fragments of a broken society, pieced together in a ring where they were ordered to destroy one another. I remember once in my teaching days, I paired students for debates, often putting together the quietest with the most outspoken. It wasn't just for balance. I wanted them to see that even the person across from you, someone you think you understand at a glance, might hold a whole world you never imagined. Spartacus must have sensed the same thing. That these men, beaten and bloody though they were, shared something that could be shaped into more than survival. The turning point came, as it often does, from desperation rather than strategy. Rations were cut. Punishments grew harsher. And whispers began to coil through the corridors like smoke. A plan took root. Escape. Not the kind of half-hearted dream that dies in the light of morning, but a tangible, coordinated act. Weapons would be stolen from the kitchen. Simple cleavers and spits. The kind meant for roasting meat. The irony was sharp. Tools of feasts would become tools of rebellion. History records that 70 men were in on it. Not a vast number, but more than enough when fueled by hunger and fury. Yet even then, things didn't go smoothly. Word leaked. Or perhaps the gods themselves, in their perverse amusement, decided to test them. Many were caught before the plan could unfold. But Spartacus and about 70 others made their move. They fought their way out of the school, wresting gladiator weapons from the very racks meant to arm them for the arena. With blood on their hands and freedom in their eyes, they fled into the countryside. Now, pause with me for a moment. Imagine the first breath they took beyond those walls. The air would have tasted different. Less of oil and dust. More of earth and possibility. I think of my own small moments of escape. Stepping out into my garden after hours indoors. Feeling the sun like a friend's hand on my shoulder. For them, it must have been like walking from the underworld into dawn. They didn't yet know where they would go. What they did know was that every road was dangerous. The countryside was filled with patrols. And the Senate did not take kindly to defiance. Yet, here's the thing about fear. It changes shape when you've already stepped into it. The men who had once been made to fight for survival in an arena now fought for survival in the open. And that, oddly enough, gave them the advantage. At first, their victories were small. Raiding supply wagons. Freeing other slaves they encountered. But small victories have a way of swelling. And soon their numbers grew. Some joined for the promise of freedom. Others, perhaps, for the thrill of standing against the great machine of Rome. And here is where the historians begin to quarrel. Was Spartacus a noble leader, intent on delivering his people from bondage? Or was he simply a tactician making use of the chaos? Did he envision a free homeland for his followers? Or was his rebellion always destined to burn out in plunder and bloodshed? I find these questions familiar, for they echo something I've asked myself many times. When we fight for something, are we really fighting for others? Or are we chasing the image of our own release? When I chose to remain in this house after my husband passed, was it for the memories we built here? Or was it because I feared the unknown beyond these walls? Perhaps Spartacus, too, was walking that line between love of his people and the pull of his own yearning. What we know is this. Rome noticed. And once Rome notices, the game changes entirely. Rome's notice came like the slow tightening of a snare. At first, it was the local militia. Ragtag forces from nearby towns, expecting an easy job. After all, these were escaped slaves, not trained legionaries. The Senate likely thought it would be a brief affair. A few skirmishes. A neat row of crucified bodies by the roadside to serve as a warning. But the countryside whispered a different story. Spartacus was not merely running. He was moving with purpose. He and his followers, now numbering in the hundreds, learned the land's language quickly. They struck where supplies were fat and defenses thin. They slipped into forests, crossed rivers at night, and used the hills as both shield and stage. I picture him, in those early days, standing atop some rocky outcrop, scanning the valleys below. Not as a king or a conqueror, but as a man measuring the weight of decisions he could no longer unmake. He had taken men from chains to open sky. But now the open sky came with the shadow of Rome. The first Roman detachment sent against him underestimated everything. They were townsmen more than soldiers. Their armor polished but their strategy brittle. Spartacus crushed them, seizing their weapons and armor for his own. I can almost hear the shock in the city markets of Capua and Naples as word spread. Escaped slaves had beaten Rome. An affront not just to power, but to the very order of the world. There's a strange truth in power. When you've been told your whole life you're powerless, the first taste of victory can intoxicate. I think about that sometimes when I see small acts of defiance in the news today. People standing against systems so much larger than themselves. You can feel the momentum building, not just in their numbers, but in their belief. And belief, my dear listeners, is more dangerous than any sword. Spartacus's army swelled. Slaves fled their masters to join him. Shepherds, deserters, even some free poor citizens took up arms under his banner. It's hard to say how many believed in his cause versus how many simply wanted to survive under his temporary shelter. But in rebellion, Motives often matter less than numbers. Rome, stung by embarrassment, sent a praetor named Claudius Glauber to end the uprising. Glauber brought thousands and thought he had Spartacus cornered atop Mount Vesuvius. Yes, that Vesuvius. Long before it would bury Pompeii in ash. Glauber blocked the only known path down, expecting the rebels to starve or surrender. But Spartacus had lived too long in cages to accept that. Here, the histories become almost mythic. The rebels, they say, wove ropes from wild vines, lowering themselves down the sheer cliffside in the dead of night. Then, circling behind Glauber's camp, they attacked at dawn, crushing the praetor's forces. The image is so vivid in my mind. Torchlight flickering on the rock face as men descend in silence. The creak of vines under their weight. The hush before chaos. I imagine Spartacus's breath steady. His mind a map of every step they would take once their feet touched the earth below. After that, Rome could no longer deny the seriousness of the threat. This was no mere band of brigands. This was a war. But here's where the story tangles itself. Ancient sources disagree on what Spartacus truly wanted after these victories. Some say he planned to march north, cross the Alps, and let his people scatter back to their homelands. Others claim he had designs on Rome itself, that he could already see the marble streets beneath his feet. And this is where I find myself caught. Not in judgment, but in wonder. I think of the nights I've sat here, alone in my armchair, looking at the lights in the windows across the street. Each light holds a life, a set of hopes I'll never fully know. Could Spartacus, in the quiet between battles, have wondered the same about the people in the city he fought against? Could he have imagined their fears, their comforts, their simple wishes for the morning? It's easy to paint history in bold strokes. Hero or villain, liberator or butcher. But lives are lived in finer lines, in the gray between dawn and day. And soon, Rome would send sharper teeth into the hunt. When the Senate finally realized Spartacus was no passing storm, they began to reach deeper into their ranks for men who could end this rebellion. But here's the strange thing. Even after Glauber's humiliation, Rome still underestimated him. Perhaps it was arrogance. How could the most disciplined military force on earth be seriously threatened by a man who had once fought for their amusement in the arena? Or perhaps it was fear of admitting, even to themselves, that the social order they had built could be cracked from below. 2 more praetors were dispatched in quick succession, each with their own legions, each confident in their ability to restore order. Both met the same fate. Ambushed, outmaneuvered, and utterly defeated. Spartacus didn't fight like a Roman general. He didn't need to. His men moved with the desperation of people who knew the price of failure. They were hunters of opportunity, vanishing into the folds of the land after striking. I can imagine the Senate's frustration. They were fighting shadows, but shadows that cut back. And in that frustration, they began to worry. Not just about Spartacus's victories, but about what those victories inspired. Every defeat Rome suffered at his hands was an invitation to rebellion elsewhere. By now, Spartacus's forces had grown to perhaps 70,000. Maybe more. A sea of the dispossessed. Men and women who had once been invisible to history. I picture their camp at night. The flicker of hundreds of fires. The murmur of countless tongues from across the provinces of the Republic. What bound them together wasn't shared language or homeland. It was the raw, intoxicating knowledge that Rome could be beaten. And yet, even in this swell of power, Spartacus made a choice that still puzzles historians. He marched north toward the Alps, where escape seemed possible. Some believe he meant to disperse his army there, letting them slip back to their homelands. Others think he was testing Rome's patience, gauging how far he could push before their true legions descended. But here's the turn that's always haunted me. When they reached the edge of the Alps, Spartacus didn't cross. He turned back. Why? Oh, the ink that's been spilled over that question. Some say his followers refused to leave, drunk on the taste of Roman defeat and eager for more. Others argue Spartacus himself had changed. No longer content to flee, but tempted by the thought of striking at Rome's very heart. And then there are those who whisper about the impossible lure of revenge, the way it can shift the ground beneath a man's feet. I think of it in quieter terms. There are moments in life when the road to safety opens before you, and yet something inside, pride, grief, the weight of those walking beside you, makes you step away from it. I've done it myself, though never with legions on my heels. Sometimes we turn back, not because it's wise, but because going forward feels like betrayal of ourselves, or of those we've promised to protect. Whatever the reason, Rome saw the turn as both relief and insult. Relief, because perhaps Spartacus wasn't aiming for the city itself. Yet. Insult, because his defiance had dragged the war on and humiliated them again. It was then that Marcus Licinius Crassus entered the stage. Crassus was not just wealthy. He was Rome's wealthiest man. A figure whose fortune was as infamous as his ambition. He took command with a seriousness the Senate had thus far lacked. And with him came discipline. He reintroduced one of Rome's most feared punishments: decimation. When a unit faltered or fled, every 10th man was executed by his own comrades. It was brutal. Yes. But effective. Fear was a tool Rome wielded as deftly as the gladius. The war began to shift. Crassus didn't chase Spartacus blindly. He built fortifications, cut off supplies, and tried to trap the rebel army. And this time, the net began to tighten. I sometimes imagined Spartacus in those days as a chess player suddenly facing an opponent who could read his moves. How many nights must he have walked the perimeter of his camp, looking at the faces of those who had followed him so far, wondering if he could still lead them to freedom. That, my friends, is the question that follows any leader in the shadow of defeat. Do they follow me? Or only the dream I carry? By the winter of 72 BCE, the rebellion had shifted into a siege of wills. Crassus's forces had driven Spartacus and his army into the toe of Italy, near the Straits of Messina. There, with a cold wind biting off the sea, Spartacus searched for a way out that didn't involve being ground beneath the disciplined heel of Rome. There was talk. More than talk. Of crossing to Sicily. It made sense. Sicily had been a hotbed of slave revolts before, and its fertile land could feed an army. If Spartacus could reach it, perhaps the fight could continue for years, forcing Rome to stretch itself thin. He made arrangements with a group of Cilician pirates, promising gold in exchange for safe passage across the narrow waters. I've always found this detail fascinating. For all his victories, for all his tactical brilliance, Spartacus still had to gamble on men whose loyalty could be bought and sold like any other commodity. And here's where fortune, if it had ever been with him, truly turned its back. The pirates took his payment and sailed away, leaving the rebel army stranded on the Italian shore. Imagine that moment. The sight of sails shrinking into the horizon, The realization that what was promised had evaporated into treachery. Desperation must have seeped into the camp like the winter damp. Meanwhile, Crassus was tightening his hold. He ordered the construction of a massive fortification across the isthmus. Ditches, walls, and wooden palisades stretching for miles. It wasn't simply a military maneuver. It was a message. Rome wasn't chasing Spartacus anymore. Rome was caging him. I think about the psychology of such a move. For months, Spartacus's army had been the hunter, striking where they pleased, vanishing before Rome's counterattacks. Now they were penned in, their movements dictated by the enemy's lines. Food began to run low. Morale wavered. And yet, Spartacus didn't crumble. In a stroke of ingenuity, or perhaps sheer necessity, he led a daring breakout. Under the cover of a stormy night, his men filled part of the Roman ditch with earth, brush, and debris, charging across before Crassus's forces could respond. Some historians marvel at this escape. Others dismiss it as a temporary reprieve. But to me, it's another example of Spartacus's refusal to be predictable. Even cornered, he could slip through Rome's fingers. The breakout was a victory. Yes. But a costly one. The rebel army was weakened, their cohesion fraying. Some groups broke away entirely, raiding independently or seeking their own paths to safety. It's here, I think, that Spartacus must have felt the weight of leadership most heavily. Victories are intoxicating. Defeats are exhausting. But the slow erosion of unity, that's the kind of loss that keeps you awake in the dark hours, wondering if the cause itself is bleeding away. Crassus, for his part, pursued relentlessly. And then came the news that must have shaken both sides. Pompey the Great was marching south. Fresh from his campaigns in Spain, Pompey had been ordered to assist in crushing the rebellion. For Spartacus, this meant the jaws were closing from two directions. For Crassus, it meant a rival might snatch the glory of ending the war. I often imagine the Senate in those days, smug in their marble halls, debating who would claim credit while thousands of lives hung in the balance. History, as I've learned, is rarely just about the clash of armies. It's about the clash of egos. Faced with this tightening noose, Spartacus made one last, fateful decision. To march north again, seeking to meet Crassus head-on before Pompey could arrive. It was a gamble. The kind that might either shatter the legions or end the rebellion in one brutal stroke. There's a moment in every story where you can feel the air change. When you know the arc is bending toward its end. For Spartacus, this was it. And I can't help but think of how many times in my own life I've felt that shift. Not on the battlefield, of course, but in the quiet turning of events. When you sense that the choice before you is the last one you'll get. I wonder if, on the eve of that final march, Spartacus walked among his people as he had so many times before. Sharing food, clasping shoulders, speaking words meant to steady trembling hands. And I wonder if he knew, deep in the marrow of his bones, that the sun was rising on his last campaign. The final march began under a sky the color of tarnished bronze. The winter light thin and reluctant. Spartacus and his army moved north with a grim determination, each step carrying them toward an inevitable reckoning. Crassus shadowed them closely, tightening his formations, cutting off supplies, forcing the rebels into a war of attrition they could not win. By now, the rebellion's ranks had dwindled. Hunger gnawed at the men and women who had once believed they might carve out a life of freedom. The faces in the column were gaunt, eyes sunken, Yet they still carried their weapons, still followed Spartacus. That loyalty, whether born of faith in his cause or simply the lack of any alternative, was a testament to the kind of leader he was. It's here that the sources diverge. And as a lover of history, I find this both maddening and beautiful. Some accounts say Spartacus tried to negotiate with Crassus, offering to disperse his army if safe passage were granted. Others suggest he never intended to surrender, that every maneuver was designed to draw the Romans into a vulnerable position. Which version is true? We'll never know for certain. Perhaps the truth, as it so often does, lies somewhere in between. But Rome had no intention of letting Spartacus go. Crassus was determined to crush the rebellion before Pompey arrived, and so he pushed his legions forward, herding the rebels toward open ground near the Silarus River. The night before the battle, I imagine the rebel camp was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with rest. Fires burn low, not for fear of discovery. Crassus knew exactly where they were, but because there was little to cook. Perhaps Spartacus sat apart, sharpening his sword by the dim light. Or perhaps he walked among the camp, speaking softly to those who had followed him through so many battles. I've often wondered what he said. Did he talk of freedom? Of defiance? Or did he simply thank them, knowing that words could not alter what the dawn would bring? You see, the danger of telling Spartacus's story is that we are tempted to fit it into neat boxes. Hero, villain, revolutionary, criminal. But real lives, yours, mine, his, don't work that way. They are messy, contradictory. The same man who fought for the freedom of thousands may also have led raids that took innocent lives. The same Rome that called itself a beacon of civilization could be ruthless in crushing dissent. When I think about that, I think about my own contradictions. There are days when I speak bravely to my neighbors, when I stand up for someone being treated unfairly. And there are days when I close my door, pull the curtains, and retreat into the safe silence of my little home. Spartacus didn't have that luxury. Every day was a choice to fight, to keep moving, to hold together an army of desperate, hungry people who had nothing left to lose. The crucifixions along the Appian Way stayed there for months, until time and the elements claimed the bodies. I sometimes picture a lone traveler, perhaps a woman selling olive oil or a boy sent on an errand, walking past those empty crosses after the bodies had been taken down. Would they remember the sight with dread? Or would the absence itself feel strange, as if the road had lost a kind of terrible presence? History often skips the aftermath. We talk about battles, victories, and defeats, but we rarely dwell on what comes after. The rebuilding, the forgetting, the way people learn to live again in the shadow of loss. For Rome, the rebellion was a wound it could not afford to acknowledge for long. For those who followed Spartacus, it was a wound that never fully healed. As the years passed, his name faded from Roman records. And yet, across time, it would surface again. On the lips of revolutionaries, in the dreams of those who still long for freedom. That's the thing about certain stories. No matter how deep you bury them, they have a way of sprouting up again, like seeds scattered in the wind. Sometimes, late at night, I sit with my tea and wonder if Spartacus knew that his fight, though lost, would echo for centuries. Did he ever imagine that a woman like me, sitting alone thousands of years later, would speak his name aloud in the quiet? The thought makes me smile, even as it brings a lump to my throat. Because in that way, perhaps, he won after all. The centuries that followed were not kind to Spartacus's memory. Rome preferred its heroes to be senators, generals, and emperors, not escaped slaves who defied the Republic. His name was left out of the grand marble inscriptions, his story reduced to a cautionary whisper. And yet, even silence leaves traces. I once stood in the ruins of Capua, where his rebellion began. The arena stones are cracked and overgrown, but you can still feel the space breathing, the way sound might have carried over the sand. I imagined a young Thracian gladiator standing in the holding pens, the weight of iron chains around his wrists, smelling dust and sweat, feeling the raw determination building in his chest. Was that Spartacus's last moment as a man defined by Roman ownership? Did he know, on that particular morning, that life would never be the same? Rome's official histories painted him in the colors of a dangerous outlaw. Plutarch and Appian gave us some details, but their accounts were already silted with bias, written to make Roman order seem inevitable. To them, Spartacus was a threat, a disruption to be explained and contained, not celebrated. But history has a peculiar way of slipping free from the hands of those who try to control it. By the Middle Ages, storytellers began weaving Spartacus into their own tales. Not as a rebel to be feared, but as a figure of daring. Troubadours sang of warriors who fought against impossible odds. While they didn't always name him, the spirit was there. Even in the shadows of feudal Europe, the idea of resistance took root. Centuries later, in Renaissance Italy, humanist scholars dug into the dusty scrolls of Rome's past. They read about Spartacus with fascination, but also caution. In an age when city-states were obsessed with order, a slave leader could still be a dangerous symbol. Still, the rediscovery of classical histories breathed life into his name. Artists painted scenes of ancient battles. Playwrights began to imagine the drama of the uprising. The Enlightenment gave him yet another face. Philosophers in France and Britain, writing about liberty and natural rights, found themselves returning to the question: who deserved freedom? Spartacus became a rhetorical device, proof that the desire for liberty was not the invention of philosophers, but a truth embedded deep in the human heart. I think often about the strange way his image traveled, morphing with each retelling. To Roman senators, he was chaos. To medieval minstrels, a tragic hero. To Enlightenment thinkers, a question mark carved in stone. And to some in the modern era, he was a rallying cry. When the revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries swept across Europe and the Americas, Spartacus's name found new life in speeches and pamphlets. Abolitionists in the United States invoked him to show that the fight against slavery was as old as slavery itself. In Haiti, Toussaint Louverture's struggle carried echoes of Spartacus's rebellion. Not because they shared the same tactics, but because both men fought a superpower on behalf of those denied humanity. Even Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, seated in smoky rooms piled with books, admired Spartacus. They saw him as the ancient world's greatest hero of the oppressed. A man whose vision, though cut short, spoke to the possibility of overturning unjust systems. And so the name that Rome tried to bury became a banner waved by those who dreamed of tearing down empires. I suppose this is the strange gift of time. It allows us to reclaim what was once lost, to see old lives through new eyes. But it also forces us to confront our own selective memories. We resurrect Spartacus as the hero we want, not necessarily the man he was. And perhaps that is the lesson in itself. That history is not just what happened, but what we choose to remember. When I think about this, I think about my own life. The parts people remember about me might be the warm greetings at the market, the jars of jam I gave out at Christmas, or the stories I tell in the library reading group. They may never know the nights I cried into my tea, or the times I let fear stop me from speaking up. We all leave behind a version of ourselves, edited by the world. Spartacus left behind many versions, and as the centuries rolled on, he would find his way onto banners, into books, and even, one day, onto the screen. His name spoken in movie theaters across the world. But that is another part of the story, and it tells us as much about us as it does about him. By the dawn of the 20th century, Spartacus had slipped the bonds of history and entered the realm of myth. His name was no longer just ink on ancient parchment. It was printed on pamphlets, chanted in rallies, and whispered in prison cells. One of the most vivid modern revivals of his story began in Germany after the First World War. The Spartacus League, Spartacus Bund, as they called it, was a revolutionary socialist group led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. They saw in him the perfect symbol for the fight against oppression, the embodiment of rebellion against entrenched power. Even though their uprising in 1919 was crushed, the choice of his name revealed something striking. Spartacus had become more than a man. He was now a universal metaphor for defiance. And then came Hollywood. In the 1960s, Stanley Kubrick's Spartacus brought the Thracian rebel to life on the silver screen, with Kirk Douglas in the lead. That film didn't just retell the ancient story. It reshaped it, sanding down the rough edges and painting Spartacus as a romantic hero. It was a spectacle of color, music, and defiance, ending with the famous scene of men standing one by one, declaring, "I'm Spartacus." I remember the first time I saw it, years ago in a little community theater that smelled faintly of popcorn and floor polish. I was young then, sitting in the dark, my hand loosely clasped in my late husband's. We were swept away by the grandeur, the swelling music, the pride in the faces of those men willing to die rather than betray a friend. It was beautiful. Yes. But I knew, even then, that the truth had been polished for comfort. Real rebellions are messier. Their heroes less certain. Their sacrifices quieter and lonelier. Still, I can't deny the power of that moment. People left the theater with a little more steel in their spine. A little more awareness that loyalty and solidarity can transcend fear. Perhaps that is the magic. And the danger of retelling history. It can inspire, but it can also simplify. Outside the glow of cinema, the world continued to find Spartacus in unexpected places. His name appeared in labor union halls, in poetry, in songs sung by civil rights activists. In the 1970s and 80s, amid movements for racial justice and indigenous rights, his story re-emerged as a symbol of the long, unfinished struggle for dignity. In South Africa, activists compared their resistance to his rebellion. In Latin America, his name was invoked by those fighting military dictatorships. It's fascinating, and perhaps a little unsettling, how one life can be claimed by so many causes. The Romans who fought him would not have recognized the Spartacus celebrated in these banners and speeches. But maybe that's the point. Heroes are shaped not only by their deeds, but by the needs of those who remember them. When I look at the arc of Spartacus's legacy, I see an ongoing conversation between past and present. Each generation decides what it needs from him. To some, he's the warrior who fought for freedom at any cost. To others, he's proof that the oppressed can unite against overwhelming odds. And to a few, he's a warning that revolts, no matter how righteous, can bring chaos as well as hope. I suppose I understand that tension more than I used to. Growing older, you start to see the gray spaces in people's lives. Spartacus may have fought for liberty, but he also commanded an army that raided, burned, and terrified. We can't pluck out the virtues and ignore the flaws without losing sight of the real person who lived and breathed. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the house feels too large for one person, I think about how my own story might be told after I'm gone. Would anyone remember the stubbornness that got me into trouble? Or would they only recall the warm bread I baked for neighbors? The gentle voice I used with children? We all want to be remembered kindly. But we also want to be remembered honestly. That's a harder wish to grant. Spartacus didn't get to choose his ending. And he certainly didn't get to write his history. Neither will most of us. But in the strange way of things, his name still walks the world, carried by people he never met, in languages he never spoke, in causes he never imagined. And that, I think, is as close to immortality as any of us can hope for. The question of who Spartacus truly was lingers like the last notes of a fading song. Was he a hero of the oppressed? A dangerous rebel? Or simply a man caught in the teeth of history? The truth is, he was all of these things, depending on where you stand. Ancient Roman writers, most of them senators or members of the elite, framed him as a grave threat to the stability of the republic. A man whose skill and charisma almost toppled the social order. Later admirers cast him as the embodiment of freedom. A figure willing to risk everything to break the chains of slavery. Somewhere in between lies the more complicated, human Spartacus. A man born free in Thrace, forced into servitude, trained as a gladiator, who seized a moment to turn his personal escape into something far larger. The debates about his intentions will likely never end. Did he truly dream of dismantling the slave system of Rome? Or was he simply trying to get himself and his followers back home? Historians argue, weighing fragmentary evidence, contradictory accounts, and the absence of Spartacus's own voice. In this absence, each era has filled the silence with its own needs and desires. For me, the real fascination lies not in solving the riddle, but in recognizing the layers it reveals about us. How we tell Spartacus's story says as much about our time as it does about his. In moments of upheaval, we shape him into a revolutionary. In quieter times, we make him into a romantic figure of loyalty and endurance. We can make him a saint, or a warning, depending on the lesson we wish to learn. I think often about how history is less a stone monument and more a flowing river. Stories shift and swirl with the currents, carrying different meanings downstream. My own life, in its smaller way, has been like that. There were days when I felt strong, unyielding, ready to take on the world. And there were other days when I was simply trying to keep my head above water, clinging to whatever bits of comfort I could find. In the end, what draws me most to Spartacus is not the battles or the banners, but the quiet, human truth that even in the harshest circumstances, people can find ways to resist. Sometimes resistance is loud and defiant. Sometimes it is the simple act of refusing to surrender your dignity. When I think about him, I imagine that final moment. Outnumbered, surrounded, his dream in ruins. There must have been fear, but perhaps also a strange peace. He had lived fully, fiercely, and left a mark that no one could erase. Even in defeat, he had stolen a measure of freedom from the world that had sought to crush him. And now, across more than 2,000 years, his story has reached us. told and retold, reshaped and reimagined. It invites us to ask ourselves, what chains would we break, if given the chance? Wind down, 200 words, as the story of Spartacus drifts into the quiet of the night. I hope you carry with you the understanding that history is never just about dates or battles. It is about lives, lived in the midst of impossible choices. Spartacus's journey reminds us that courage can wear many faces, and that freedom, once dreamed of, has the power to echo for centuries. It's a comforting thought, in its way. No matter how small our own acts of kindness or defiance may seem, they too become part of the great tapestry of human memory. Even the smallest threads can change the pattern, if woven with care. So tonight, as you rest, think of the lives before ours. Of a Thracian gladiator who dared to dream. Of those who followed him. Of those who remembered him long after the dust of battle had settled. Let that thought settle in your heart like a gentle weight, steady and warm. And when you close your eyes, may your dreams be filled with stories of the past, where courage and hope walk hand in hand across the fields of time.